The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training facility as 30 elite Navy SEALs gathered for their monthly medical briefing. These were men who had seen combat in the most dangerous corners of the world, warriors who carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from surviving impossible missions. They filled the sterile conference room with an air of restless energy, some checking their phones, others engaged in low conversations about upcoming deployments. At exactly 0800 hours, the door opened and their new combat medic walked in. Sarah Martinez was smaller than most of them had expected, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She wore the same desert camouflage uniform as the rest of them, but somehow looked almost fragile among the towering figures of the Special Operations team. A few of the SEALs exchanged glances, their expressions revealing a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The team leader, Commander Jake Reynolds, stood to make the introduction. His weathered face showed the lines of a man who had spent 15 years in special operations, and his voice carried the authority that came with leading some of the military's most elite soldiers. Sarah had been assigned to their unit after completing advanced combat medical training, and while her credentials were impressive on paper, many of the team members wondered if she truly understood what she was getting into. Sarah set her medical bag down on the table at the front of the room and began organizing her equipment with practiced efficiency. Her movements were precise and controlled, but there was something in her eyes that caught the attention of Sergeant Mike Torres, a veteran of 3 Middle Eastern deployments. He noticed how her hands remained perfectly steady even under the scrutiny of 30 pairs of eyes, and how she seemed to check the exits almost instinctively when she entered the room. The briefing began with routine medical updates and new protocols for field treatment of combat injuries. Sarah spoke clearly and confidently about advanced trauma care, explaining new techniques for treating gunshot wounds and blast injuries in austere environments. Her knowledge was clearly extensive, and she answered technical questions with the kind of detail that only came from real experience. However, some of the team members still seemed unconvinced, wondering if book knowledge would translate to performance under fire. As the meeting progressed, Petty Officer First Class David Kim noticed something unusual about their new medic. When she demonstrated certain medical procedures, her movements showed a familiarity that went beyond training exercises. The way she handled simulated trauma scenarios suggested someone who had dealt with real emergencies before, someone who had worked under extreme pressure. There was an economy of motion in her demonstrations that spoke of experience gained in situations where every second counted. The session was interrupted when Seaman Rodriguez asked a direct question about treating combat injuries in active firefights. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Sarah, waiting to see how she would respond to what many considered the ultimate test of a combat medic's readiness. This was the moment that would determine whether the team would trust her with their lives in the field. And everyone present understood the gravity of the question. Sarah paused for just a moment, her gaze moving across the faces of the men who would become her brothers in arms. There was something in her expression that none of them could quite identify, a shadow that passed behind her eyes before she began to speak. What happened next would change everything the SEALs thought they knew about their quiet new medic, and would reveal a story of courage and sacrifice that none of them had expected to hear. Sarah's voice was steady as she began to respond to Rodriguez's question, but those who were watching closely noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. Her shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, and her hands, which had been resting casually on the table, now gripped the edge with a tension that spoke of memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. The conference room seemed to grow smaller as she prepared to share something that would bridge the gap between her and these elite warriors. She started by explaining the medical protocols for treating wounds under fire, but then her narrative took an unexpected turn. Sarah began describing a specific scenario with such vivid detail that it became clear she wasn't speaking hypothetically. She talked about the unique challenges of performing emergency surgery while incoming. Mortar rounds shook the ground beneath her feet. and how the sound of automatic weapons fire could make it nearly impossible to hear a patient's breathing or heartbeat. The SEALs found themselves leaning forward in their chairs as Sarah continued her account. She described working in a makeshift medical station in Afghanistan, where she had served as an army medic with a forward operating base that came under regular attack. Her voice remained clinical and professional, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that suggested these weren't just procedural memories she was sharing. These were experiences burned into her consciousness through repetition and trauma. Sergeant Torres felt his skepticism beginning to crumble as Sarah detailed the specific challenges of battlefield medicine. She spoke about the weight of carrying wounded soldiers to safety while wearing full combat gear, and how she had learned to identify the most serious injuries by touch alone when visibility was limited by smoke and darkness. Her descriptions were too specific, too nuanced to have come from training manuals or secondhand accounts. The room grew increasingly quiet as Sarah's story unfolded. She explained how she had developed techniques for stabilizing critically injured soldiers using whatever materials were available in the field, often improvising medical equipment from combat gear and personal items. Her voice took on a matter-of-fact tone as she described situations that would have tested the limits of even the most experienced medical professionals. Yet she spoke of them as routine parts of her daily responsibilities. Commander Reynolds found himself reassessing his initial impressions of their new medic. The woman standing before them was revealing herself to be someone who had been tested by fire in ways that few people could imagine. Her small stature no longer seemed like a potential liability, but rather a testament to the fact that courage and competence came in all packages. The respect in the room was becoming palpable as the SEALs recognized a fellow warrior. As Sarah continued her explanation, she began to describe specific incidents that had shaped her understanding of combat medicine. She talked about treating multiple casualties simultaneously during prolonged firefights, and how she had learned to prioritize patients based on their chances of survival rather than the severity of their injuries. The clinical nature of these decisions clearly weighed on her, but she presented them as necessary realities of battlefield medicine. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. What had started as a routine briefing with a new team member had become something approaching a confession from someone who carried wounds that weren't visible on the surface. The SEALs recognized the signs of someone who had seen too much and carried too many memories of fallen comrades. They were beginning to understand that Sarah Martinez wasn't just their new medic, but someone who understood their world in ways they hadn't expected. The silence in the room deepened as Sarah reached the most difficult part of her story. Her hands had stopped moving entirely, and for the first time since she had begun speaking, she seemed to struggle with finding the right words. The SEALs could sense that whatever came next would be the heart of what had shaped her into the medic standing before them. Even the most hardened veterans in the room felt the weight of anticipation. As they waited for her to continue, Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper as she began to describe a particular night that had changed everything for her. It was during her second deployment to Afghanistan, at a remote outpost that served as a crucial supply route for coalition forces. The base had been under siege for 3 days, with enemy forces maintaining constant pressure through sniper attacks and intermittent mortar strikes. The medical station had become a refuge for wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated due to the intensity of the fighting. She described how the attack had escalated suddenly in the early morning hours, with coordinated assaults coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The base's defensive perimeter had been breached in several locations, forcing the medical personnel to prepare for the possibility that enemy combatants might reach their position. Sarah had found herself faced with a terrible choice between staying with critically wounded patients who couldn't be moved, or evacuating to a more secure location. The decision to stay had been immediate and instinctive, but the consequences had been more severe than anyone could have anticipated. Sarah explained how she had spent 14 hours treating wounded soldiers while the battle raged around her medical station. She had performed emergency surgeries using only local anesthesia, worked by the light of flashlights when the power failed, and continued treating patients even when shrapnel from nearby explosions had wounded her own hands. Petty Officer Kim felt his throat tighten as Sarah described the moment when the medical station had taken a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. The explosion had killed 2 of her patients instantly and left her temporarily deaf and disoriented. Despite her injuries and the chaos around her, she had continued working to save the remaining wounded soldiers, using her own body to shield them from falling debris while performing life-saving procedures. The most difficult part of her story came when she described losing her closest friend and fellow medic during the attack. Corporal Jennifer Walsh had been working alongside Sarah when a sniper's bullet had found its mark. Sarah's voice cracked slightly as she explained how she had been forced to choose between attempting to save her friend and continuing to treat other wounded soldiers who had better chances of survival. The weight of that decision was still visible in her eyes years later. Commander Reynolds realized that the woman standing before them had faced the kind of impossible choices that haunted even the most experienced combat veterans. The fact that she had continued functioning as a medic after experiencing such trauma spoke to a level of mental toughness that was rare, even among special operations personnel. Her ability to compartmentalize her own pain in order to save others revealed the depth of her commitment to her mission. As Sarah continued her account, she described the aftermath of the attack and how she had been recommended for the Silver Star for her actions during the 14-hour siege. She had refused the decoration, stating that she had only done what any medic would do in the same situation. This revelation hit the SEALs particularly hard, as they understood that refusing recognition for heroic actions often indicated a level of survivor's guilt that was difficult to overcome. The room remained absolutely silent as Sarah concluded this portion of her story. Every SEAL present understood that they were in the presence of someone who had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The quiet medic they had initially underestimated had revealed herself to be a warrior who had faced death repeatedly and chosen to save lives rather than take them. After several moments of profound silence, Sarah straightened her shoulders and continued with the most challenging part of her narrative. The SEALs could see that sharing these memories was taking a visible toll on her, but she pressed forward with the same determination that had carried her through her combat experiences. Her next words would reveal the true cost of her service and why she had chosen to continue as a combat medic despite everything she had endured following the siege. Sarah had been transferred to a larger medical facility, where she was expected to recover from her physical injuries and return to normal duties. However, the psychological wounds proved far more difficult to heal than the shrapnel cuts on her hands. She found herself unable to sleep without hearing the sounds of incoming mortar, and the smell of antiseptic in the medical bay would instantly transport her back to that 14-hour nightmare when she had fought to save lives. While death surrounded her, the breaking point had come during a routine medical exercise 6 months after the attack. Sarah was demonstrating emergency procedures to a group of new medics when one of them accidentally knocked over a metal tray, sending instruments clattering to the floor. The sound triggered a flashback so severe that Sarah found herself on the ground, convinced that she was back in Afghanistan under attack. The incident had been witnessed by several senior medical officers, and questions began to arise about her fitness for continued combat duty. Rather than accept a medical discharge or transfer to a non-combat position, Sarah had made a decision that surprised everyone around her. She requested permission to undergo additional psychological counseling while remaining on active duty, arguing that her experience made her more valuable as a combat medic, not less. She spent months working with military psychologists, learning techniques for managing her trauma responses while maintaining her ability to function effectively under pressure. Sergeant Torres found himself deeply moved by Sarah's determination to overcome her psychological injuries, rather than simply accepting them as insurmountable obstacles. The military culture often struggled with acknowledging mental health challenges, particularly among personnel who were expected to be resilient under all circumstances. Sarah's willingness to confront her trauma directly while continuing to serve demonstrated a form of courage that was different from, but equal to, physical bravery. The most remarkable aspect of Sarah's recovery was her decision to return to combat medical training, but this time with a focus on treating psychological as well as physical wounds. She had recognized that many soldiers suffered in silence from trauma-related injuries that were just as debilitating as gunshot wounds or blast injuries. Her own experience with post-traumatic stress had given her insights that could help other service members who were struggling with similar challenges. Sarah described how she had developed new protocols for recognizing and treating combat stress reactions in the field. She explained that soldiers often disguised psychological wounds as physical ailments, complaining of headaches or stomach problems rather than admitting to anxiety or depression. Her ability to identify these hidden injuries had made her uniquely effective at providing comprehensive medical care that addressed both visible and invisible wounds. Commander Reynolds began to understand why Sarah had been specifically selected for assignment to their SEAL team. Special operations personnel were statistically more likely to experience psychological trauma due to the nature of their missions, but they were also more resistant to seeking help for mental health issues. Having a medic who understood both the physical and psychological challenges of combat would be invaluable for maintaining team readiness and effectiveness. The room's atmosphere had shifted again, this time from respect to something approaching awe. The SEALs were beginning to realize that Sarah's trauma had not weakened her, but had instead forged her into a more complete warrior and healer. Her willingness to share her struggles openly was itself an act of courage, as it challenged the military's traditional reluctance to discuss psychological injuries with the same openness as physical wounds. As Sarah neared the end of her story, she revealed the personal philosophy that had emerged from her darkest experiences and now guided her approach to combat medicine. The transformation from a traditional medic focused solely on physical wounds to someone who understood the complete spectrum of battlefield injuries had not happened overnight. It had required her to confront her own limitations and rebuild her identity as both a warrior and a healer in ways that challenged conventional military thinking. She explained how her experience with post-traumatic stress had taught her to recognize subtle signs of psychological distress in other soldiers. During her subsequent deployments, she had begun treating anxiety attacks and trauma responses with the same urgency and professionalism that she applied to gunshot wounds. This approach had initially met with resistance from some commanding officers who viewed psychological symptoms as character weaknesses rather than legitimate medical conditions. The breakthrough had come during her third deployment, when she had successfully treated a Navy SEAL who had been experiencing panic attacks during combat operations. The soldier had been on the verge of being removed from his unit when Sarah intervened, recognizing that his symptoms were manageable with proper treatment and support. Her intervention had not only saved the SEAL's career but had also prevented the loss of a highly trained operative who was crucial to his team's mission. Success. Word of Sarah's unconventional but effective treatment methods had spread through the special operations community, leading to her current assignment with the SEAL team. Her reputation as someone who could keep elite warriors in the fight, despite psychological injuries, had made her a valuable asset in maintaining operational readiness. Military leadership had begun to recognize that addressing mental health proactively was more effective than waiting for psychological wounds to become debilitating. Petty Officer Kim found himself thinking about his own struggles with sleep disturbances and hypervigilance following his last deployment. Like many of his teammates, he had assumed these were normal consequences of combat service that he simply needed to endure. Sarah's openness about her own psychological injuries was giving him permission to consider that seeking help might be a sign of strength rather than weakness. The most profound revelation came when Sarah described her current mission philosophy She had come to understand that her role as a combat medic extended far beyond treating physical injuries during firefights. Her responsibility included maintaining the psychological readiness of her team, ensuring that warriors remained mentally prepared for the challenges they would face. This holistic approach to combat medicine represented a significant evolution. In military medical thinking, Sarah concluded her story by addressing the elephant in the room that had been present since she first walked into the conference room. She acknowledged that some team members might have initial doubts about serving alongside a female medic, particularly one who had openly discussed psychological trauma. However, she argued that diversity of experience and perspective made teams stronger, not weaker, and that her unique background would enhance rather than compromise their operational capabilities. Commander Reynolds realized that the briefing had evolved into something far more significant than a simple introduction to their new medic. Sarah's willingness to share her complete story, including her struggles and vulnerabilities, had created an opportunity for the entire team to examine their own attitudes toward mental health and psychological readiness. This conversation would likely influence how they approach stress management and trauma response for years to come. The tension in the room had completely dissipated, replaced by a sense of unity and mutual respect that surprised everyone present. The SEALs had expected to evaluate their new medic's qualifications, but instead had found themselves challenged to reconsider their own assumptions about strength, vulnerability, and what it meant to be a complete warrior. Sarah had not only proven her credentials, but had also elevated the entire team's understanding of comprehensive combat readiness. The conference room remained silent for several long minutes after Sarah finished speaking, but it was a different kind of silence than what had filled the space when she first entered. This was the silence of reflection and newfound respect. As 30 elite warriors processed what they had just heard and reconsidered everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and the true cost of military service, the woman standing before them had revealed herself to be not just their new medic, but a fellow warrior who had fought battles they were only beginning to understand. Commander Reynolds was the first to break the silence. But when he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that reflected the significance of what had just transpired. He thanked Sarah for her honesty and service, acknowledging that her willingness to share her complete story had given the team insights that would make them more effective as a unit. Her experience with both physical and psychological combat wounds would enhance their readiness in ways that traditional medical training could never achieve. One by one, the other SEALs began to respond to Sarah's story, but their questions now carried a different tone than the skeptical inquiries that had marked the beginning of the briefing. They asked about specific techniques for recognizing combat stress in teammates, and how to provide support for psychological injuries without compromising operational security or team morale. These were the questions of professionals who recognized expertise when they encountered it. Sergeant Torres found himself thinking about teammates he had served with over the years, warriors who had struggled with invisible wounds that the military culture had taught them to hide or ignore. Sarah's approach offered a path forward that honored both the warrior ethos and the reality of psychological injury. Her story had given him language and concepts for addressing challenges that he had previously considered unsolvable problems. The most significant moment came when Seaman Rodriguez, who had asked the original question about treating combat injuries under fire, stood up and formally thanked Sarah for her service. His gesture was followed by the rest of the team, creating a spontaneous recognition ceremony that acknowledged not just her medical qualifications, but her courage in sharing experiences that most people would prefer to keep private. This moment marked Sarah's true acceptance into the Brotherhood of Warriors. The briefing concluded. Several team members approached Sarah privately to discuss their own experiences with combat stress and psychological challenges. The conversation she had initiated was clearly going to continue beyond the formal meeting, creating opportunities for healing and growth that wouldn't have existed without her willingness to be vulnerable. Her story had given permission for honest discussions about topics that were rarely addressed openly in Military settings. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's integration into the SEAL team proved to be seamless and highly effective. Her combination of technical medical expertise and deep understanding of combat psychology made her an invaluable asset during training exercises and mission planning. The team's initial skepticism had been completely replaced by confidence and trust, based not just on her qualifications, but on their recognition of her as a proven warrior. The impact of Sarah's story extended beyond just her immediate team assignment. Word of her approach to comprehensive combat medicine began to influence medical training programs throughout the special operations community. Her emphasis on treating psychological wounds with the same urgency as physical injuries represented a significant shift in military medical thinking that would benefit countless service members in the years to come. 6 months later, when the team was deployed to a high-risk mission overseas, Sarah's value became even more apparent. Her ability to maintain team psychological readiness while providing world-class medical care validated everything she had shared during that first briefing. The wounded and silent medic who had walked into their conference room had proven herself to be exactly what they needed when they needed it most. Her story had become their story, and together they formed a more complete and effective fighting unit than any of them could have imagined.